Hello, everyone, and welcome to what I'm delighted to say is the very first episode in our podcast series covering the ever-changing dynamics of integrated marketing, communications, and asset management. Live from the Nest, I'm your host today, Max Hilton, Managing Director here at Peregrine USA. I'm also joined by my fellow co-host, Josh Cole. And for those that don't know, Josh is our Vice President and illustrious Group Head of Analytics. So everyone, in terms of the series itself, over the ensuing quarters, we're extremely excited to present a really incredible lineup of senior marketing and brand professionals from some of the most revered names in our space, with ultimately the aim of discussing the most pertinent and pressing challenges, trends, and opportunities sector-wide. Most importantly to today, and of course hard on the heels of last week's launch of Peregrine's 2020 Global 100 report into marketing communications performance, we're absolutely delighted to be kicking off this series with a deeper dive into the report findings with two really phenomenal operators and friends of Peregrine, some of the best of their field, no less. So let's start off with Jennifer Manser, Head of Marketing and Communications Americas at Schroders, and Kelly Vives, Head of Marketing for Wells Fargo Asset Management. So Jennifer, Kelly, thank you both so very much for joining us today. So like all good podcasts before it, we're really trying to keep the format compact enough to fit into a breakfast, lunch, dog walk, indeed laundry break. So without further ado, let's get right down to it. To that end, Josh, do you want to kick off the conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Max. So I think we wanted to start really at the top level. I think the first thing we want to talk about is brand awareness, and actually one of the really key salient findings from our latest Global 100 report was that for the second year in a row, we've seen the majority of asset managers either with stagnant or indeed declining brand awareness, which is obviously a huge cause for concern across the wider industry. I think let's start, Jennifer, if we can, just talking a little bit about what we think might be driving this, whether you think it's just a function of the sort of increasingly competitive dynamic across the wider industry.
Sure. Thank you both, Josh and Max. Appreciate the opportunity to chat today. So, as we think about the industry, I think we recognize it is certainly a very competitive landscape across asset management. This year has proven to be obviously one of the more challenging years in history. The current environment we're operating in is consumed with a tremendous amount of noise and just overload across the board. Financial services firms are fighting for shelf space in the hearts and minds of individuals, institutions across multiple industries. So I think while within asset management, it's a challenge for brands to stand out, we are competing against the more global ecosphere of brands, holistically. Priorities have refocused, and the ability to cut through that noise is a challenge. So I think one of the key things for brands is to stay true to their self in terms of what they're known for, and making sure that their clients, their prospects, their customers really know and understand sort of at the core what their purpose is. I think that is one of the key ways to help sort of differentiate yourself and making sure you've got a holistic approach in delivering that brand.
I think that's a phenomenally important point, especially around authenticity. There is something that we see all too real, and actually brings us quite nicely on to what we were looking to talk about next, Kelly, which is really, as an asset management brand, what can you actually do about it to make sure that you're leveraging that brand properly, to make sure that you're building it over time? What sort of concrete things can managers be thinking about on that front?
Yeah. I've been joking with my team and some of my peers. I was listening to a podcast about BMW, and when they put their cars on the assembly line, one of the last steps is they shake it like vigorously for 20 seconds to see like any nuts and bolts will like unscrew. And I'm like, that's what being a marketer has been in 2020, right? It's like, you just had to like survive. And, you know, we all got shaken probably around early March. You know, and I think it's been a tough year. And I think finding that mind share in this super crowded space has been hard, right? I mean, personally and professionally, people are overloaded, right? You're trying to keep up what's going on with COVID, trying to homeschool your kids, right? You're trying to, you know, read about all this election content that's coming up. You're trying to keep up what's going on in the market. Who do you pick to do that, right? Are you finding new people, or are you just going to your old trusted sources? And so I think, you know, standing out has been really hard. You know, I think rethinking and, you know, echoing what Jennifer says, having what's your purpose, right? What are you trying to get out there? What do you want to be known for? I think rethinking the ways you deliver content. Twitter says less than 10 seconds. I think in our industry, maybe a minute might be our barometer for video content. But, you know, how do you connect and how do you tailor for the audience? I think that's super critical. And, you know, early in the pandemic, we probably weren't doing it as much, but now later this year, we've been tailoring for a financial advisor versus a consultant versus an institution, and trying to kind of tailor exactly what they want to pop off the page to something that really speaks to them and the content that they're looking for, you know, but it's tough. I mean, we're commoditized in asset management. And I think, you know, how do you stand out? And I do think really focusing on the people is a really big part of that, because that's how you can be a bit more of a storyteller.
I really like that BMW analogy. I think it's definitely been a year for being shaken and hopefully not stirred, if you can allow me to make a very I think on the topic of being, you know, shaken and stirred, I think what that's really shown is those firms who've got really clear, definitive cultures that they can essentially mobilize in these times of stress and anxiety and uncertainty. And I think it's particularly noticeable that I think this year, more than any preceding year, we've seen far more inquiries in terms of firms looking to do that culture piece, the mission, vision, values piece, the sort of culture messaging piece. I mean, Kelly, do you think that essentially when it comes to companies' culture, the messaging around that's probably become even more important than ever before?
Yeah, undoubtedly. And I think, I mean, going back to what I said, right? People is what we do. Our business is built around relationships. I mean, we as marketers will try to do all the personalization to help our sales teams make it feel personal, but ultimately people relationships are the heart of our business. You know, I think defining what your culture is hard, right? Nailing that narrative. How do we sound not commoditized? How do we, you know, engage differently and have, you know, something that feels really authentic and fresh, maybe a little bit unexpected in our category. You know, also D&I, that's popped up a lot this year, and that's really important. And in asset management, you know, I think we've got a lot of work to do. And so, you know, I think there was a McKinsey report this year, and it said that companies in the top quartile of racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns above the industry average. And so there's actual proof points, right? And so you want to reflect what our client base looks like, right? What people walking on the street look like. That's a recruiting tactic as well, right? That's a retention tactic. So there's so many pieces that go into culture. But the hardest part, and what we all struggle with as marketers, is nailing that narrative. And how do you actually bring that to life? And how do you make it storytelling about the people, as opposed to kind of those buzzwords that everybody kind of expects from from firms like ours?
Yeah, exactly. And it's always that challenge around authenticity again, isn't it? When it comes to finding the right balance between something that's, I think, aspirational enough that it's bold, but also true enough to something that's got a really organic core to it. That's the challenge, I think, for us. As marketers. I mean, Jennifer, in terms of actually deploying and weaponizing that weaponizing probably the wrong word in this context, but mobilizing, if I can say, the sort of culture messaging and the culture campaigns. It's obviously one thing to get that messaging set in place. There's obviously then a big challenge then to actually make sure it's distributed correctly, it's brought to life. What would be your kind of thoughts around how to do that really effectively?
Yeah, sure. I mean, activation of that culture and really sort of delivering that externally and internally is both equally critically important. And as Kelly mentioned, we are in a people business, and ultimately at an organizational level, our people are our greatest asset. So if you can foster a culture in which your people believe in what your purpose is, and there are your greatest ambassadors in terms of delivering that message externally. So I think it's been ever more important to make sure that you've got your own internal staff and employees on board prior to taking that externally. In terms of thinking about how you then activate that message more broadly, obviously, again, 2020 is a year for the history books, but as we saw a lot of, social injustice, particularly here in the US, but globally, having a stance and having a perspective and finding ways in which at an organizational level, you are going to ensure that, you are tackling diversity and inclusion and making sure that everyone understands what your stance on that was critically important. So I mean, one of the tactics, that we sort of approached this year was really focusing around social media and LinkedIn in particular, and having a voice, both from a corporate level, but also from our executive level. Again, people trust and know the people that they've got relationships with and connections with. So finding ways to sort of get that content out there and get that message out there from a culture perspective was critically important. And we've actually seen some great traction on that message.
Yeah, and layering onto that too, it came to mind while Jennifer was speaking that, this isn't even just marketing, branding, advertising, right? I mean, consultants are doing cultural due diligence meetings, right? I mean, they're sending out RFPs just on your culture, right? So this is like a key decision point, the same way ESG will be forward looking in how they, select managers. So this is kind of a full coordinated kind of business need. Lucky for us, marketing, should and will be in the driver's seat in defining it. But, I do think that the pressure is kind of there, and we need the narrative in partnership with our distribution teams.
I think the consultants piece is obviously critical to that. I mean, one of the things that we really tried to do in the Global 100 this year was to also focus on that culture piece. And one of the big challenges really was trying to find a way, which I think we managed to do with a reasonable outcome through the 3Ps framework, was to actually try and map Willis Towers Watson's culture framework into the sort of marketing and communications arena, so that you can sort of see how well firms are actually making the sort of back end tangible and manifest on that side of things. So I think that's the consultant side of things obviously huge. I just wanted to head back towards the digital the marketing side of things, because one of the things that really surprised me from the research, in fact, it surprised me so much that I actually asked the team to go back and look at it again, because I thought there must be some kind of mistake, was that I really assumed this year that we were going to see digital engagement go through the roof. And actually, what we saw from the data was that on average, for the average firm, it tended to have really dropped quite significantly. I think one of the key data points was that the average firm's average LinkedIn engagement was about 26%, so a quarter of what it was this time last year, which is pretty staggering. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that, and I think Schroders is one of them. Jennifer, just in terms of actually what firms can do to actually make sure that they are standing out and having effective social media, would you like to talk a little bit about what you think makes for really impactful, high quality content?
Sure, happy to. And as I sort of touched upon before, I do think, as we all recognize going through sort of a pandemic and going to digital very quickly, there was an overload of content. So I think one of the key things in terms of sort of cutting through that noise is staying, again, true to your brand and true to those topics which people know you for. So, one of the key initiatives, and we did see the opposite in terms of engagement this year, because we were so prescriptive around the topics in which we talked about. We saw the consistency and the delivery of message really sort of ramped up. Obviously, diversity and inclusion, sustainability, and at the core, we are a London-based asset manager, but being here in the US, we're really in terms of thinking about having a global approach. So we stayed true to those values. And I think that's one of the key messages out there for other asset managers is try not to be all things to all people. Obviously there are topics that you want to touch upon in terms of what's happening in the markets and having a view and a perspective. But if you run the gamut, I think that's something that, could dilute your brand. One of the other elements in terms of digital and particularly around social was having much more engaging content and different mechanisms in terms of delivering that message. So visual representation, infographics, social cards, short videos. So finding ways that's not just content, in your sort of shorter delivery, but different mechanisms to engage across the board, and having that sort of multi-channel approach, I think is key in terms of social media.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, especially in terms of the point around not trying to be everything to everyone. I think that's always one of the great sort of temptations as a marketer, is that there are so many sort of calls on our time to, promote this and push that it's easy to sort of lose that sense of direction. So I think that's obviously a critical point. Just to go back to that point around sort of content overload, Kelly, do you think it's fair to think to sort of hypothesize as we have, I think, that there is this sort of sense of Zoom fatigue and content overload that's led maybe to lower engagement in general?
Yeah, I think so. I'm struggling with it a little bit, right? Because same as Jennifer, our numbers did go up, and then you assume, people aren't commuting, they have more time to engage, but maybe that commuting time is when they were on LinkedIn or on different properties and doing their reading, and that time's gone away. So, I struggle, but that would be kind of my hypothesis as well. And, I also think more people have been on digital, right? So if your footprint of people that you're speaking to are bigger, and I do think that's, your numbers are going to be lower. And so I think, looking forward, that's probably a silver lining of COVID, right? All these, individuals that may not have wanted to engage digitally, they forced our hand, right? I mean, we're all doing these Zoom meetings. My CEO wasn't a Zoom guy, right? And now he absolutely loves it, and loves using it for management meetings and client meetings. And so, Zoom, digital engagement, the tactics that Jennifer was talking about with infographics and animations and quick hit, really short content, that's how we're consuming stuff in our personal lives. So that translates to how we're going to consume content professionally, despite what some of our distribution teams may think, right? We'll always have the big PDF, but there's going to be, I think, more of an appetite. And I think lucky for us as marketers, some of these digital trends and tactics that we've been trying to push for so long have been accelerated by COVID. So I'm seeing a silver lining on it. I think people shouldn't be discouraged by the numbers being down, because maybe the footprint and the denominator was bigger.
I think that's definitely a fair point. I actually just wanted to talk a little bit now about your respective brands. I think one thing that was quite interesting from your results in particular was that obviously both Schroders, both Wells Fargo Asset Management, arguably significantly outperformed their size in terms of AUM, and you were both much further up the rankings for your overall marketing and communications performance than you were for if you'd simply been ranked by AUM. Jennifer, what do you think is the key to really making sure you punch above your weight? Bearing in mind, obviously, that you've got the particular challenge of being a sort of an asset manager with a London heritage, as you said, that's really building its presence and has been doing for quite some time in the US. Would you like to touch on that briefly?
Yeah, so obviously, I think our challenge is quite different than other asset managers here in the US, given that we have a very large global footprint, but not as large here in the US, and we have been expanding on that. I think it continues to come back to what I said earlier, staying true to who you are at the core of an organization. And I do think the delivery of that message across multiple mechanisms and mediums, so everything from digital to paid to search to advertising, earned media, making sure that consistency of message is happening across multiple channels, not just in one. And that's where I think, despite wherever you may be consuming, and everybody is different, we know, clients institutional clients, consultants are different in terms of the way they consume information. You want to be in all of those different mechanisms. So I think part of that is just being much more strategic and thoughtful around kind of where you place your marketing and advertising dollars. And, while you may not be able to compete with sort of some of the larger advertising spends, but you can be much more strategic in that delivery.
I couldn't agree more. What would be your thoughts, Kelly, around outperformance and punching above your weight as a brand?
Yeah, and as a brand, it's interesting, we're the inverse, we're the flip of Jennifer, right? We have a big US presence and a very small international footprint that we're trying to grow. So, we have the benefit overseas of people don't know Wells Fargo the way that they may know them in the US or have any preconceived notions. So there you've got a little bit more white space, which has its own challenges, right? But you're kind of building the brand the way that you want to. And so, in the US, people will have a preconceived notion. They want to understand how we're linked to the main enterprise. And so, we kind of have to make sure that the narrative, despite, white space or preconceived notions, is consistent, back to what Jennifer is saying, right? And that, it's very focused, it's very surgical, and most importantly, investments, leadership, distribution, everybody's beating to the same drum, everybody's sharing the same messaging, which is hard, right? And it's hard to have consistency, and it's the hardest to get everybody to agree on the message, right? But, I think to stand out and forward looking is, we're trying to just inject a little bit of fun and personality into things, right? And just how do you pop off the page and maybe be a little bit unexpected in the category? And, that's the only way to move forward if it's fresh and it's modern and, it kind of surprises people a little bit. So that's kind of our goal. And, we may be treating it differently in the US than international, because we do have, kind of different audiences and different strategies there.
Yeah, I think that surprise and delight element is always a constant challenge, isn't it? So it's almost like a sort of constant sense of reinvention in terms of what that surprise and delight looks like. My last question really is one is very much for, again, both of you. Bearing in mind how effective you've both been as brands this year, I'd be just interested to hear what you think has worked best, what you've been most proud of, what was most exciting. Perhaps if I go to you first, Kelly.
Sure. I think if I think about, 2020 and a very quick pivot to digital, there's three things that kind of stick out in my mind. Starting in March, we kind of reset our blog. It was a little sleepy. People kind of read it, right? And I was like, listen, this is the way we can get the fastest information into people's hands, right? And things were changing at that point, same day, right? So we kind of up-leveled our blog experience, and we've had tremendous, response to that. I think we've had like over 70,000 people visit the blog this year, which is like way up from last year. So, I'm proud of that. And on that, we post a lot of podcasts. So kind of like re-strategizing around these quick hit ways to connect. The second was our creativity around some events. Like, it's hard to get people to attend stuff, right? You're like, we'll buy you lunch, like, please just attend, And so we did a really cool series, both internationally and in the US, with wine tastings, where we linked it to sustainability and biodynamic wines. And so we had the wineries talk about how they dealt with all of these things thrown at them this year, right? The fires more recently, all of this climate change, right? How are they dealing with the bumps in their industry? And then how are we translating that to our portfolios and the incorporation of, climate and all of these ESG factors into our investing? We sent wine to people's houses. It surprised and delighted them a little bit, I think, Josh. And, we've gotten a really good response. We're doing a bunch of them for the holidays, because who doesn't want to go to a wine tasting, right? So that was good. And then lastly, we didn't shy away. We ran campaigns. We did an international one around like, we're here for you. This is a tough time. We weren't promotional. It was actually featured in the Global 100 report as a case study. So take a peek, but we had real faces of our team on Zoom. Like, we're real, we're honest. This is what's happening. And then we did something around portfolio rebalancing, but I was kind of proud that we rallied. We didn't shy away. And, those things kind of stick out looking back this year.
Yeah, we really loved that, the culture campaign that you guys did internationally, and I have to say that some of the Peregrines enjoyed the surprise and delight of the wine even more.
Yeah.
That was a memorable feature of 2020, a rare good moment of 2020. Jennifer, what would be your thoughts about what you've been most sort of proud of, or most excited by, or you thought was kind of coolest that you guys have done?
It seems like, pivoting and finding different ways to connect was definitely a theme. So while we didn't go the wine route, we went a mixology route. So we did host events, across our client base, and sent, great little sort of craft, personalized mixes and sort of things to kind of create cocktails. So that was actually quite successful. And again, brought a little bit of a different sort of connectivity to sort of the client base, which actually proved to be quite successful. You also mentioned podcasts, and podcasts had actually been something that at an organizational level we had focused on, but one of the things that we pivoted to, in sort of recognizing sort of the need for more content and sort of more targeted content, particularly for our audience here in the US, we launched that at the end of April, and, the numbers have been exponential in terms of engagement across the board. So, I think at the core of everything that we did was sort of focusing on content and sort of thinking about sort of the delivery of those mechanisms across the board. I will say, I think one of the core things that I think was quite successful, and this goes back to culture, is that it starts with your employees and how you feel as an employee going through this pandemic. So, one of the fantastic benefits of Schroders is our global CEO did a weekly podcast and just was very open and honest around, what he was seeing in the marketplace, in addition to what he was seeing at home. So it really helped connect sort of the people sort of to that brand and to that culture. And again, I think that helped carries that externally as well. Similarly here in North America, our CEO, did a weekly email blast. So it's that connectivity to your employees that I do think is really important as you continue to want to think about how you build brand going forward.
I think that's one of the really encouraging things actually about what has obviously been such a challenging year, is that I think for those brands that have been able to be a bit more agile, it's actually been a real opportunity to show a more sort of authentic and more grounded face, I think. And I think it's been really obvious which firms have managed to do that and which haven't. So I think it's been obviously it's been such a tricky year on so many fronts, but it has been in a way an opportunity for what Justin Trudeau obviously calls the Great Reset, an opportunity as well.
So Josh, I'm afraid I'm going to have to interject as we've slightly overshot our intended window. So I think that's all really we have time for now. But again, most importantly, Kelly, Jennifer, thank you both so very much for joining us today. I think, in fact, we managed to cover some incredibly useful and timely ground. So round of applause to you both, consummate professionals as ever. And finally, thank you to everyone joining us for this inaugural podcast. We've really got a wonderful pipeline of guests from some of the world's biggest firms. So do subscribe at the bottom of the screen there if you'd like to be kept in the loop on any and of course all future podcasts. Indeed, next time around, we'll have two of the most impressive outperformers from our study with a specific focus on how to circumvent content overload, which was a key component to today's conversation and indeed the report findings. So once more, thank you, stay safe, and have a really great rest to your day. Take care all. Bye.